Speaker.
Claire Curran.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in the my colleague David Clark, in his contribution to the second reading of this bill, made it clear that Labor would be supporting this bill with some quite strong reservations. And while we support and have supported right from the very beginning the intent of this bill, and continue to support the intent of this bill, along with pretty much all of the submitters that came before the Select Committee, the reservations that we have only really got stronger, particularly as each day goes on, about this government's capability to introduce a new system in a way that's not going to end up turning into a bungle and creating a whole lot more cost than it was when it was set up to save money. And Mr. Speaker, I'll certainly be speaking to those remarks throughout my contribution. We thought that this was a relatively uncontroversial bill. We thought that there were probably some things that needed to be teased out in the Select Committee, and they certainly were. But as we went through the Select Committee process and listened to what some of the submitters were saying, we became more and more concerned. We remain supporting this bill, as I said, with quite strong reservations, because ultimately we support the intent. We support the intent of a number system for business, whether that's in the private sector or across the public sector, to enable there to be more efficiencies and easier interactions for business in New Zealand. Which in his remarks, the Minister said in the second reading that this would enable easy and more efficient interactions. It would do so by allocating a unique number to corporate and public entities and to unincorporated entities that are in business, such as sole traders, partnerships, trustees of trusts. Well, that sounds great, but in practice, particularly in the short to medium term, that's just not going to be the case, because the government's not ready. The government did not do its work. The government agencies, there's a very small number of government agencies that actually will be prepared for this new system when it comes in. The rest of them are not. And as we went through the Select Committee process, more and more submitters became concerned. They became concerned about that, and they became concerned that there wasn't a requirement for government agencies to get their act together. Now, Mr. Speaker, so this has the hallmarks of what we're seeing as a pattern of half measures, halfway house, possible shambles of a new system that's being introduced. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that what we are looking at through this bill, if it gets pushed through its third reading in the short term, that we are looking at the making of another major, another embarrassing IT blunder by this government in terms of its implementation of what is not a bad idea. As I said, we support the intent of it, but there's no plan and there's no indication of the resources that are going to be needed to make this actually work as a system across government. And there were too many red flags started to be raised during the Select Committee process that we have some real concerns. Now, of course, as we know, Mr. Speaker, this government has a track record of these IT shambolic, embarrassing blunders. We've just seen one in the last couple of days with the payroll scandal within MB that's affecting a huge number of employees, which is essentially exposing the government's mismanagement and incompetence of a merger of departments, great big merger, creating a great big ministry, need to create a payroll system, right across that, what did they do? They created a system that is now, we're now starting to see the real problems emerge around that. Not only that, we've also heard today that the MB is being revealed that MB is paying a quarter of its invoices late, that it's over, and this is my colleague Jacinda Ardern revealed this today, that more than 11,000 bills not being paid on time. It's a breach of the payment rules that it publishes. The relevance, Mr. Speaker, to this legislation going through the House is quite clear. This is actually about a government that makes these decisions, decides to think big, merges a whole lot of departments, comes up with an idea, puts a system in place, and then stuffs it up. Quite right. So struggling with the payment system. So if they're struggling with the payment systems, and let's remember NovaPay, and let's remember the $40+ million, that was a Stephen Joyce special. Let's remember just exactly the impact of that is still being felt in schools. I was in a school just on Monday where I was being told of the continuing issues. Of course, our schools, they're run by competent people who have adapted to this shambolic system and are managing, because they're committed to what they're doing, they're managing to get on with the job. But it's taken a massive amount of time and energy, and wasted time and energy within each school of the 2,500, is that right, of schools throughout New Zealand, to actually adapt to the shambles that the government foisted upon us with the NovaPay debacle. And that's not all in terms of mismanagement. And we've also seen another major piece of mismanagement this week within the Ministry of Health, with a refurbishment cost of $24 million from reserves that didn't even exist, and the Minister describing it as a forecasting error, and diminishing its importance. But what this points to, Mr. Speaker, is a pattern. It's a pattern of making decisions, putting forward legislation, and it's not always a bad idea that the government comes up with, the idea of a New Zealand business number. Not a bad idea, but has the work been done? Has the work been done to work out before the legislation comes to the House about how it's going to be implemented and what the impact of that is going to be? And just to display to the House that it's not just Labor saying this, Mr. Speaker, in the Select Committee, their submission, the Chartered Accountants, an eminently sensible organisation, noted that they were in favour of the bill and its intent, but they felt that the New Zealand business number would need prompt and broad integration by government agencies in order to capitalise on these so-called benefits to businesses. They said their views in this regard had not changed throughout their process of being associated with the bill. They said, "We are therefore disappointed to note that the current bill no longer mandates government agency recognition of the New Zealand business number as it did in section 34 of the initial bill." So, Mr. Speaker, in section 34 of the initial bill that came to this House, that was tabled to this House at the beginning of this process, there was a mandate for government agencies to be a part of this process. Now, that mandate during the process, as the government realised that they did not have all these agencies ready to go through the processes that they needed to, they withdrew that. They withdrew it, and as a result, we're left with a bill that, if it's passed, will be piecemeal. That there's likely to be a shambolic approach by government agencies that aren't prepared for a New Zealand business number. It will, in the end, create a more complicated system. It won't deliver the efficiencies, certainly in the short to medium term. And this government has brought a bill to the House that it's just not prepared for.